today will begin shortly. Welcome to our stakeholder webinar on climate, wildfire, drought, and access investments from the California Natural Resources Agency. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Ambers. I'm our Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources at the the Natural Resource Agency here. Welcome to our webinar. On the heels of the governor's incredible announcement yesterday, we wanted to invite you all to an intimate conversation with our team and our Secretary and Undersecretary today. Most importantly, we'd like to take this time to hear any questions you have and provide some answers for you. So please use the question box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions to us along the way. We'll try to get to some of those questions during presentations, but if not, we will have a question and answer section at the end of today's presentation. And to begin, I'd like to open up this conversation and welcome the Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency, Wade Crowfoot. Wade, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrea, and it's good to be with everybody here today. We're going to jump right into sharing details of this pretty incredible budget, but I wanted to share at least some high-level thoughts for a few minutes. First of all, huge thanks for joining. We've got almost 500 partners and stakeholders in our discussion today. I'm actually down in Los Angeles today for a couple of important reasons, and the way I describe it is this. This has obviously been a really, really challenging time for us all between navigating the global pandemic and coming to the recognition of accelerating climate change and its impacts. You know, this summer we have folks across our agency working to combat catastrophic wildfires, to navigate the second huge drought in a decade, and to navigate what we do about extreme heat across our cities. At the same time, never too far from our mind, are flooding risks and, of course, sea level rise. So given all these challenges, you know, I'm focused on maintaining hope and maintaining focus. And we do that by taking action. In Los Angeles today, really glad to meet with a set of groups who are very close to breaking ground on the world's largest animal overcrossing over the 101, which among other things is going to help recover this remarkable mountain lion population we have in California. I'll also be participating in a water conservation event tomorrow with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power to really elevate the need for reduced water use and water conservation, this 15% voluntary reduction that the governor has called for. So from my point of view, the way we all address these unprecedented threats is by taking unprecedented action. And I'm hoping we can all recognize that this budget does just that. The legislature, the governor are allocating $15 billion to take climate action, reduce climate pollution, or carbon pollution, I should say, and to build our resilience to those threats that I mentioned. The Natural Resources Agency, EPA, OPR, the Department of Food and Agriculture, so many agencies are working across the administration to implement this budget. And so today we wanted to take a deeper dive into areas of the budget that our agency and entities within our agency will be responsible for spending. Our goal is to get these resources working across the state to address these threats we're facing like wildfire and drought, and to build our climate resilience all the while. I'm also really excited that we have an unprecedented amount of investment in really meeting this promise of building equitable access to our outdoors. We recognize that different Californians have different levels of access to this incredible nature that we have based on where they live and their economics. And we're committed to changing that and now have an unprecedented amount of money for that. I'm also really proud that this budget includes more general fund investment in nature than ever before, with the focus on maintaining our biodiversity. So we'll hear from colleagues on that as well. Once again, big thanks for joining today. Do share your questions in the Q&A function, and then you'll have information at the end of the presentation that you can reach out to us if you have more specific questions that aren't answered here today. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. So to begin our conversation, we'd like to invite our colleague, our Deputy Secretary for Climate Change, Amanda Hansen, to talk to us a bit about the climate resilience funding that was included in the governor's budget announced yesterday. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really thrilled to be here and to be coming off of the heels of such an exceptional and unprecedented budget signing yesterday. The governor talked about future-proofing California, and really sort of talked about how this is moved away from being an intellectual conversation, and it's moved into the realm of being more of an emotional conversation. So to build on Wade's comment that this budget invests more in nature than any other general fund commitment in history, I would also just note that it also provides us with some time to plan and to execute our funding for those solutions. It really just represents sort of proof positive that our governor and our legislature are really serious about climate action across all sectors, but also really elevating the role of nature-based solutions, which can also sort of improve our public health and safety, secure food and water supplies, drive economic prosperity, increase equity, et cetera. So these investments span several packages, and they tackle a broad suite of climate risks. Many of them also really focus on building resilience in diverse communities, focusing on those that are most in need of support. And to deliver on the governor's nature-based solutions executive order, California is investing $1.3 billion in multi-benefit and nature-based solutions over the next 3 years. And these funds really are intended to kickstart implementation of our natural and working lands climate smart strategy and put us on the path to conserving 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030, which my colleague Jen will go into more detail on. And at least 120 million of the nearly 800 million set aside for that implementation will be deployed through our conservancy. So we're really excited to build that out in partnership with all of you and with the legislature. And I would also just note that this funding is in addition to climate smart land management efforts that will be detailed by my colleagues throughout this presentation, as well as others that are going to be driven by sister agencies, such as several programs in CDFA's Sustainable Agriculture Package and Cal EPA's Circular Economy funding. I also want to highlight some of the investments that the governor made in extreme heat, which is an urgent and deadly impact of climate change that is already here in California and projected to get worse across every region in the state. The budget invests $800 million to protect vulnerable communities through multiple different climate solutions, which include accelerating nature-based solutions through our urban greening and urban forestry programs, $250 million, and $350 million to be in a set aside that would really allow us to kickstart implementation of an extreme heat framework that we're going to be updating and finalizing later this year. And finally, I'll just point to an unprecedented investment in science. We are funding the 5th climate assessment, And the governor's budget allocates $22 million for this effort because it underpins all that we do across sectors to build climate resilience in California. Really helps us make decisions based on best available science that's really explicitly focused on California. There's also a really exciting $50 million pilot project to create carbon negative fuels from materials coming out of forest vegetation management projects. So I'll stop there and apologize in advance for any questions that I may not be able to answer. I am single parenting today, and so need to do kid pickup at some point. So if I don't get to you, please reach out to me anytime. And I'm going to hand it over to Nancy. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Nancy Vogel, and I'm Deputy Secretary for Water at CNRA. Before I had that title, I was the director of the governor's water resilience portfolio. I helped to develop that portfolio with many different agencies, boards, commissions, councils, and stakeholders, including many of you. And that blueprint is that water resilience portfolio is a blueprint. It's the Newsom administration's water policy blueprint. And I'm grateful that we got it finalized in July 2020, about a year ago, in time to help guide the immense resources that we see in this budget for water resources and short-term response to the drought and long-term water resilience. In the water package, I'm going to walk through it pretty quickly. It's overall $5.2 billion. And of that, there's about $815 million for immediate drought response. Now, bear with me as I break down that $815 million. There's $500 million for immediate drought relief projects. And of that, $200 million is for small communities. And I'm happy to report that the Department of Water Resources, in collaboration with the State Water Resources Control Board, already last month has begun to distribute the funding. It's $53 million that's already been directed to help small communities. And that money is going to go to things like, for example, replacing 4 miles of leaky pipes in Orange Cove, or purchasing a pump to pressurize the emergency interties for the city of Ukiah, and covering costs to haul water to a rancheria in Sonoma County. There's $200 million more for drought relief projects that will be distributed by the Department of Water Resources in coordination with their colleagues at the Water Board for multi-benefit projects. And that can include ecological improvement, and $100 million for urban water districts, larger districts. And DWR is working overtime to get the guidelines out for distribution of that drought relief funding. In the drought package, the $815 million drought response package, there's $127 million for some pretty geeky stuff that I'm very excited about, because it's going to enable our support of local water districts and stakeholders as they work towards water resilience. That includes research, data, communications, stream gauges, groundwater monitoring for wells near disadvantaged communities, collection of airborne snow observation data, forecast informed reservoir operations, $13 million, which is our share to help leverage $100 million in federal funding for a desalination research investment. And then also $30 million, and this is important, to begin modernizing the water right data infrastructure we've got in this state, which hasn't seen modernization. It needs it if we're going to be nimble enough to respond to drought. There's also in the budget for drought $12 million to the Water Board to respond to drinking water emergencies, which can include drilling new wells and interties and hauling water. $10 million to the Department of Water Resources to provide leak detection and technical assistance to small communities. $5 million to our colleagues at the Department of Food and Agriculture to help growers improve their water use efficiency. And then $50 million to the Department of Conservation for a new program that will help local communities, mostly in the San Joaquin Valley, as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is implemented, and we need to reduce irrigated acreage in certain places. That $50 million will help locals figure out how to do that in a way that can help improve habitat restoration without harming public health and without doing any damage to the local economy. And I can assure you that the Department of Conservation is going to provide extensive outreach as they develop that program. If you want to be part of that, I'm sure you will be able to be. There's also tens of millions of dollars in the budget to bolster staff and resources at CDFW, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Water Resources Control Board for all the folks who are handling their issues like the curtailment of water rights, human-wildlife interactions, rapid permitting of drought response projects, and monitoring and permitting water project operations. Overall, beyond drought, the water package is going to enable us to make what I hope is tremendous progress implementing the water resilience portfolio and put us in a better position for the next inevitable drought or flood. There is $1.3 billion in American Rescue Plan Act funding to assist local agencies with drinking water and wastewater projects, $30 million to help public water suppliers deal with contamination from polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, which has taken some Southern California groundwater wells out of commission, $200 million to support local water recycling and groundwater cleanup projects, $200 million over 3 years to support the state's efforts at the Salton Sea to minimize the air pollution that comes off of that dry lake bed and to restore habitat for migratory waterfowl and shorebirds as well. $200 million over 2 years to improve the major conveyance structures that have been damaged by subsidence tied to groundwater overpumping. That money is going to support planning and permitting, design and construction of projects such as raising canal embankments and canal liners so that we can improve the efficiency of the movement of water. And then $638 million in the budget over 3 years for flood projects, because lots of times droughts end in flood. $100 million in the budget for CDFA for SWEEP. This is a program which gives grants to farmers for projects to reduce energy consumption and improve water use efficiency. There's $445 million for projects that would programs and projects to improve environmental conditions to promote the recovery of native fish species in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta watershed, which covers about 40% of the state. $105 million for wildlife corridors and fish passage, and of that, $65 million should be targeted, prioritized for the drought effects on fish and wildlife. $250 million for protecting fish and wildlife, that this can with improved environmental flows. This could involve the purchase of water rights from willing sellers or acquisition of land that involves water rights. $20 million will go to the Water Board to help improve the water quality in the rivers that flow from Mexico to Southern California. And then finally, there's $50 million in the budget for urban streams, and that will be divided among Southern California Conservancies and the Department of Water Resources. So our work now is to spend these public funds carefully but swiftly to secure a more resilient future for ourselves and for our kids. And I'm happy to try to answer your questions. Thank you.
I think it's over to me. Hi, everyone. Thanks to everybody who's putting questions in the chat. We are going to try to answer those. Just a reminder, you can add them there. I think what you should see about this budget, at least I hope you do, I do, which is all the different synergies across the programs that represent an opportunity to achieve multiple benefits, really results across many of our priorities. So I think that's a really exciting feature of this budget, in addition to the fact that it's really substantial investments in what is very important for California. So I'll go quickly through the biodiversity and habitat pieces. As Amanda already shared, we're going to spend $758 million across CNRA's departments, boards, and conservancies for programs and activities that advance multi-benefit and nature-based solutions, including those that support implementation of 30 by 30 by protecting biodiversity and driving climate action. These funds will help implement our natural and working lands climate smart strategy and our Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy, both of which are coming out later this year. So the point about having an opportunity to plan, it's great. We have these plans almost finalized, and we'll be able to use these resources to implement both of those. Other funding that supports biodiversity and habitat and 30 by 30 cross-cuts several other budget portfolios, including $600 million for coastal resilience projects. OPC is going to talk about those. There's $200 million for habitat restoration in the climate resilience package for DWR, another $125 million in the water package for habitat restoration projects. And Nancy already mentioned the $105 million for wildlife corridors and fish passage. I think there's just a lot of great opportunity to protect fish and wildlife. I'm very excited to work with all of you on getting these dollars on the ground. And I will pass it to Jessica.
Thanks so much, Jen. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. This climate resilience budget includes $1.5 billion for wildfire resilience. As a point of comparison, we had a base budget of $200 million for wildfire resilience in the previous years. So this is a huge surge. $536 million of that was already appropriated in an April emergency appropriation to get shovel-ready projects out the door on the ground. You're seeing that those dollars deliver action through our conservancies, partners, CAL FIRE grants. 85% of that money is already committed into projects delivering results for communities. The second phase of this $1.5 billion is what the governor signed off on yesterday, $988 million for much larger scale, really structural investments. This wildfire resilience $1.5 billion package total invests across 3 fronts of wildfire resilience. So we're making investments across landscapes to lower the intensity of fires and return ecological fire to the landscape. We're investing around communities, so putting in strategic fuel breaks and interventions so that communities can escape during a mega fire. Firefighters have tools and places to be able to stage themselves to protect communities. And then the last area is really investing inside of communities, that home hardening and defensible space, so that in the worst case scenario, a fire comes through, the homes are less likely to ignite, and we don't get the homes as the center of a fire. So across those 3 fronts of resilience, we're modifying fire behavior and lessening the intensity of these fires to help us be able to tackle this fire crisis head on. In addition to investments in direct programs across those 3 fronts of resilience, we're also investing in structural reforms. So investing in workforce development, business development, so that we have destinations for woody material coming out of the forest, whether it's innovative or traditional. We're investing in lots of regulatory reforms as well, so we can get projects started faster, and investing in better science. So that includes $25 million for remote sensing, for example, so that we can better target our interventions to have the impact that we want to see. These investments, this $1.5 billion package, it incorporates 40 programs across 21 different departments. So this is really a whole of government effort, and it's really anchored in our goal of having regional collaboratives drive this. So we have $110 million in there for the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, which is investing in those regional collaboratives to design cohesive projects. And I'll just give you an example of how this really all seems together. With some of our early action dollars, some of that $500 million from April, we invested in the San Diego Resource Conservation District, which was our local partner in the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. They had planning dollars, they had staffing dollars. It enabled them to design a regional collaborative across landowner types for the San Diego region. Then we got dollars into them through the early action program, through the San Diego Conservancy, through CAL FIRE fire prevention grants, and CAL FIRE forest health grants. So different buckets of grant dollars then invested in those regions, as well as investments from state parks and Fish and Wildlife to be able to manage their land in that area. This started delivering contiguous results for that area. So again, we are anchoring in regional planning dollars and the different flavors of grant dollars that we have available, then invest in the projects identified by those regional collaboratives to deliver contiguous results. Because those wildfires are not going to stop at a jurisdictional boundary. So we need to be smarter than that. This investment is smarter than that. So this is a game-changing investment in wildfire resilience that is keeping both California's communities and our ecology safe into the future. And we are really excited to partner with you to getting this out the door. So let me pass it on to my colleague, Matt Baker, who is going to talk to you about all of our investments and innovative front on the energy front. Matt.
Hi, glad everybody's here today. This is a big day for us. On the energy side, the advances in the state budget will help us expand planning and permitting capacity to be able to meet our energy and climate goals. A couple of high-level highlights in the area of offshore wind energy, which is one of the more exciting areas where the state is moving forward. The budget includes $20 million, roughly $20 million, for an interagency effort to advance permitting, responsible outreach, and capacity building so that, permitting, outreach, and the port development necessary to move forward developing our offshore wind resource in an environmentally responsible way. It also includes $38 million to the planning agencies, mostly the Energy Commission and a little bit to the Public Utilities Commission, to expand, to push forward to meet our SB 100 goals. And this also, I think, crucially, includes $15 million to the Department of Fish and Wildlife to help beef up their staffing so that we can both be thorough and efficient as CDFW is processing permits for wind and solar projects, again, in an environmentally sound manner. One really neat project that I just want to highlight is a pilot that will be awarded to the Department of Water Resources to award a grant to irrigation companies that have large canals to do a pilot to study by actually study the effects of covering a canal with solar. And so this is a $20 million grant that will actually take a section, probably about a kilometer, of one of the state's canals and cover it with solar and be able to look at what are the implications of doing so, both for energy production, water conservation, as well as really key issues around how do you access the canal and in order to conduct maintenance on it. So we're very excited about this. We think that this will really help advance us forward and meeting our Senate Bill 100 goals. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Mark Gold, Deputy Secretary for Oceans. And again, this is Matt Baker, Deputy Secretary for Energy. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat.
Thanks, Matt. And I appreciate you covering offshore wind. And thank you, Jen Norris, also for covering 30 by 30. It's been great, obviously, partnering with you and continue to partnering with you, Jen, on that effort with us covering sort of the salty side of California. So you've already heard the big issues on the coast and ocean. The biggest thing is $500 million to the Coastal Conservancy for coastal resilience projects. They're not specified at this point, so that's all going to be determined in the future. But this could include such projects as restoration of coastal wetlands and watersheds, beaches, dunes, bluffs, living shorelines, et cetera. And so right now it's pretty broad. There's a lot of things that are eligible for it. And so we'll be spending time working with our agencies in CNRA to really figure out what the highest priorities are. But the lead there, of course, is the Coastal Conservancy on the $500 million, which is just so sorely needed and such an important investment. Then there's $100 million, and by the way, that's 22, 23, and 23, 24 budgets. Then there's another $100 million to the Ocean Protection Council for resilience projects on coastal climate resilience projects that will conserve, protect, and restore marine wildlife and healthy ocean and coastal ecosystems. And so they include kelp forest habitat, eelgrass, seagrass, the state system of marine protected areas, looking at the MPAs from the standpoint of what can be done to add more climate resilience there. Really, there's such a sore need to create climate resilient fisheries. And so there's going to be a lot of effort in that, where we will work hand in glove with Fish and Wildlife as well as the Fish and Game Commission on those issues, as well as we really got to get to climate ready fisheries. It's such a big priority. Other issues could include harmful algal blooms, marine invasive species, of course, ocean acidification, which has been such a high priority for the OPC and the State Water Resources Control Board for quite some time, as well as hypoxia issues. So the 100 million can really be spent on any sort of climate ocean issue. So that flexibility is going to be really important. As you heard earlier from Jen Norris, as well as Amanda Hansen, about the dollars for multi-benefit. So I'm not going to go into that there, but you can imagine coastal wetland projects could definitely fall into that category as well. The other big part of the state investment on coastal resilience has been in planning. And I know everybody's really excited about that, which is there's $30 million to the Coastal Commission, which people have known about for quite some time, that will go for the next 5 years for grants to local communities to integrate sea level rise adaptation in their local coastal plans. And so hopefully by the end of that period, the whole coast of California will largely, if not completely, be covered with having strong and consistent sea level rise adaptation plans as part of their LCPs. So really excited there. And then another 11.5 million to state parks to implement their sea level rise adaptation strategy that came out very beginning of this year. And that will be both for planning as well as resiliency projects. So definitely a pretty exciting year to move forward on coastal resilience. And with that, I'll pass it over to Angela.
Hey, thank you so much, Mark. And thanks everybody for joining. I just want to remind everybody for question and answers, just go ahead and click that button at the bottom of the screen, listed Q&A, and make sure that we get to your question. We're about to start Q&A right after me. So I have the great pleasure of speaking to all of you about our amazing access program work that has just gotten the most incredibly historic boost. This 21 budget basically has just put us, on the map in terms of this Outdoors for All work that we really want to make sure is incorporated. So just, I think taking a small step back, and this is, stating the obvious slightly, but, what the COVID crisis really illuminated for so many of us is the way that parks and the outdoors are just incredibly critical for kids, for individuals, for our communities across the state. The benefits of accessing the outdoors has such incredible positive impacts, whether it's health and well-being, mental health, jobs and local economic development, education. We could name so many different ways that access to the outdoors is just incredibly beneficial. And what is kind of hard to believe, though, is that in a state as rich in natural resources, such as California, we actually have a significant and inequitable gap to access to nature. We have 6 out of 10 every Californian. So 6 out of every 10 Californians are considered to have poor access to quality open space. And so this couldn't be a bigger priority, but also we are so lucky to have the governor and the first partner as just the biggest champions for this work. They are personally passionate about ensuring access to the outdoors for everyone in California. And so this 21 budget, 22 budget also had some pretty phenomenal investments. And so, I'll just highlight a few, but really excited to work with all of you as we launch our Outdoors for All initiative to make sure that we are really setting that blueprint, the roadmap for everything we want to do with access, with your priorities and your help as part of that. So the investments include some pretty significant deferred maintenance and wildfire reconstruction funds for state parks, $402 million. So many of you may remember Big Basin was devastated by wildfire last year. So a significant amount of work is needed to bring that park back, but also to help manage all the different state parks that we have. We have $180 million in local grants to build parks infrastructure throughout the state. through the Parks Development and Community Revitalization Program. It's a phenomenal program that works with many of you, basically, to ensure that we can build and ensure infrastructure across the state, and just so excited about all the different projects that will be able to be possible with that funding. I'll also highlight, there's $75 million in there for priority parks acquisition. So making sure that we're able to get out there and work with all of you to make those parks happen. This is a really phenomenal one, $40 million in critically needed funding for outdoor education and transportation through the Outdoor Equitable Access Grant Program. These are these programmatic dollars that are so hard to come by. And this is going to be huge infusion into the world of all the folks who are really trying to get kids and different types of communities, especially disadvantaged communities, into the outdoors. Two more that I'll highlight is $24 million in grants for coastal access programming. This is through the Explore the Coast and the Whale Tail programs. So, this is just specifically to the coast and making sure that as many Californians can access those incredible sites every year. And then we have $9.1 million for 3 innovative pilot projects. And this was a huge priority for the first partner, was to expand parks pass access. And many of you have heard this, Every Kid in the Park, that program that the National Park Service put together. And this is piloting a similar program where all 4th graders in California will eventually have access to a Parks Pass for free to be able to get them and their parents and their entire families out into the parks. And make sure that having that Parks Pass is just not anything that is a barrier to getting kids into parks. So I'll stop there just because I think those are the exciting highlights, and we're happy to chat more about that. And in 2021, you've seen such incredible investments across the board, and just so thankful for all the work that all of you are doing to help support and champion this effort. So with that, I will pass back to Andrea Ambrise, who will be helping us with the Q&A.
Thank you, Angela, and we all hope that you've enjoyed and learned a bit about some of our many policy priorities. Now we'd like to shift our conversation to really engage in a dialogue with you, answer some of your questions. Again, please use the question and answer box to submit any questions you have. I think we'll start with a few, and then we'll continue to monitor along the way. With that, I would like to invite my colleagues, if you are free and available, to join us back into the meeting. And James, if you can help us join in gallery mode together so you can see us and our team ready and willing to answer some of the questions that come in. So there is a first question around the Outdoors for All initiative, something that you were just touching on under Secretary Barranco. And there's an interest for knowing where folks can learn a bit more. And then also if the Education Department and or Transportation will be providing any grants, and who would be administering some of those covered that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to share that it's actually State Parks, who obviously knows a lot about access, who will be distributing those outdoor access grants. And so I'm happy to drop in the chat what that address is so you guys can check it out. And that's also where the parks infrastructure grants will also be distributed. So I'll drop both links in there so that you guys can have full access to all of the grant guidelines, as well as the different timelines for the opportunities. But I'm really excited that our state parks leadership are, really driving this forward.
Thank you, Undersecretary Barranco. And I'd also like to introduce one of our newest colleagues as well, our new Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice, Moises Moreno Rivera. He will also be working in tandem and support with us as we're advancing some of our Outdoor for All initiatives. So give a quick wave to everyone, Moy. And please contact Moy if you have any kind of interest in engaging on some of our environmental justice outreach initiatives. With that, I'd like to go to another question around the emphasis on adding native plants. So the question comes from Susan. Will there be an emphasis on adding native plants when greening is added through all state funding sources so that biodiversity is a co-benefit of all greening projects? Jen, I think that's for you.
Well, thanks, Andrea, and thanks everyone for the great questions. There are a lot of good ones in there. So this one the question overall, I really appreciated the emphasis, if I'm reading the right one, on the need to restore riparian areas and streams and bring back native vegetation. I think that is absolutely an emphasis of a lot of our large-scale multi-benefit habitat restoration projects. We know that native plants are really important to the overall function of ecosystems. So I think that will be a priority definitely moving forward.
And I would only add, Jen, that Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that our urban greening grant projects actually has criteria for the plants that get selected for the plantings, and includes with having benefit for biodiversity and native plants.
Yeah, a lot of our programs do that already in their grant guidelines. They have areas where they emphasize that native plants should be used first.
Thank you, Jen and Brian. There's another question around the urban streams funding. So, John asked, please describe the $50 million for urban streams to Southern California allotment, including making waterways more friendly to wildlife. Perhaps I'll also invite Jen and Undersecretary Barranco to answer.
I believe that's funding to state parks, am I right?
No, the urban streams funding is going to conservancies in Southern California and to the Department of Water Resources. It's split up 10 million, 10 million, 10 million, et cetera. And I'm sure some of that funding will find its way to the Los Angeles River projects that are underway, but DWR also has a larger statewide perspective with their urban streams restoration program.
Thank you, Nancy. There's a question from Natasha, the phrase nature-based solutions, what does that mean, especially in the context of wind-driven fires, such as Caldor, where CAL FIRE and the Forest Service and many others have been engaged recently. Jessica, perhaps you can help us provide some color on that, as well as others.
Andrea, I'm glad to provide, oh, there she is.
Sorry, I was trying to answer a question and it didn't let me swing back. So the question is about wind-driven fires and the Caldor fire?
Yeah, and just broadly, nature-based question was, so what is nature-based solutions, and do we advance nature-based solutions given these like wind-driven fires? What does that mean?
Absolutely. So I think it's really important to recognize that California is a fire adapted ecology. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is to get fire back to its normal ecological levels, because the catastrophic mega fires that we are seeing are very far outside of the ecological norms, even historically in California. So what we do across these kind of three fronts of fire resilience is a lot of what we're doing is thinning out the landscape so that we can potentially return natural fire back onto that landscape. Because if you just let a match today, there's too dense of fuel, and you get those crown fires, which are catastrophic to both watersheds and ecologies. So it may require sort of a human intervention on the first round to be able to thin out those landscapes. Once you do that, you can then return ecological and normal fire back to the landscape, which actually really helps germinate native plants. But we're seeing this kind of throughout all of our projects. These aren't necessarily very far apart. So for example, there's a fuel break in Colfax that CAL FIRE has been working on. They thinned out the understory. They worked with the California Native Plant Society, and they burned their slash piles in a way that really targeted germinating morning glory and milkweeds. So it's now monarch butterfly habitat. And I think it's also really critical that we don't sort of differentiate between wind-driven and fuel-driven fires. Often the phenomena that we're seeing is that these fires are so heat intensive with so much fuel that they start generating their own weather system. And so it's often sort of high fuel loads that then help generate these intense weather systems. In one windy red flag warning days, fires behaving erratically, but also the dryness on the landscape is causing erratic fire behavior. So really all these three resilience efforts are targeted to the local ecology of that community and allowing us to keep pace with the realities of climate change that we're facing.
Thank you, Jessica. Another question is around our coastal watersheds and if there are restoration funds and opportunities for investment for the implementation of stream habitat. So wondering perhaps if that's Mark Gold and or Jen Eckerly to help us.
Jen.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Now we can.
Okay, great. I can try to address this question. There's certainly, close to or $600 million in the budget that goes towards coastal resilience projects that can include restoration of a range of habitats that include coastal wetlands and watersheds. So that would include river and riparian restoration, as well as dunes and bluffs and bays. So yes, there are significant investments and funding available for those restoration projects.
Thank you, Jen. We've received another question from Carol regarding opportunities for investment in the Bay Delta. Nancy, may I pass that to you?
Sure, there's a lot of funding in this budget for habitat restoration in the Bay Delta watershed, and also projects that would improve environmental flows. And I'm thinking, for example, of the $200 million that Jen mentioned that's in the Department of Water Resources budget for habitat restoration. And I know that the department's got some large scale wetlands restoration work underway in the Yolo bypass and elsewhere in the Delta, that money will advance. There's also, as I mentioned, the $445 million for different projects that can help make water available and improve the condition of habitat in the Bay Delta watershed. And there's funding for permanent acquisition of environmental flows with a priority, with an emphasis on improving Delta outflow for environmental purposes.
Thank you, Nancy. We have another question around a initiative that we're very committed to and asking around near-term next step actions being funded to advance the 30 by 30 goal that the agency has, working on behalf of the governor's initiative. Perhaps I'll pass that over to Secretary Crowfoot and also Jen.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, we're excited that this budget, as I said, makes what we consider to be unprecedented investments in nature, particularly to protect and restore nature in the age of climate change. And obviously a big part of that is making progress on our target to conserve 30% of California by 2030. This is the 30 by 30 initiative, which is part of a global movement to protect a third of the earth, both for climate action purposes, but also to reduce the mass extinction crisis we face across the world. So just a bit of an advertisement on the effort through Jen or Dr. Norris's leadership here. We are establishing a 30 by 30 pathways strategy. In other words, a roadmap of how we're going to get to 30 by 30. And we'll have later this year a draft 30 by 30 strategy for your review. And we're hoping that partners, stakeholders can review that across the state. That draft benefits from input from literally thousands of Californians through a lot of input process that we've had. But in any event, that's going to be the roadmap. We're not waiting for that to actually make progress on 30 by 30, and things like this wildlife crossing that I'm down in LA talking about today are an example of implementing that 30 by 30. But Jen, specifically, what are investments within this budget that will help advance 30 by 30?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I think there are lots of opportunities to advance 30 by 30 across the budget. Whenever we're restoring habitat to its natural state, we're supporting nature-based solutions to climate change, and we're protecting biodiversity writ large, right? So we're not just thinking about endangered species, we're thinking about all of the biodiversity of California and protecting it across multiple different ecosystems and landscapes. So we've got, about $305 million for habitat restoration distributed across DWR and within the agency. And the $758 million set aside for nature-based solutions and 30 by 30, that's really designed to help us implement those strategies. I saw a question in the chat about how we're going to allocate that funding. I believe there's 60 million of that allocated directly to the conservancies every year. I'm looking at Amanda Martin, but the remainder we want to use to apply to the strategies we're developing on nature-based solutions and 30 by 30, and really use that money to accelerate our efforts in that space. So with those plans, we will be able to develop a clear breakdown of how we'll spend that money in out years.
And Andrea, I might just mention the role that Native American or tribal governments, as well as tribal communities play, we hope will play in 30 by 30. You know, the work stewarding California's natural environment, you know, for thousands of years was thanks to tribal communities. And in the Resources Agency, we're on a journey to strengthen partnerships with tribal governments towards shared stewardship, co-management of these resources. And so an important principle of our 30 by 30 is how do we reconnect partnerships or connect partnerships with tribes who can teach us obviously so much about stewardship across the environment. And I thought it might be a good opportunity to introduce to participants here today our first ever Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs, Geneva Thompson. And it's fitting with this introduction because, of course, it's Californian Native American Day, which is celebrated across the state and across tribal communities, recognizing the culture, the community, and the resilience of California tribes. So happy California Native American Day. And Geneva, welcome to the team. We're really excited for you to ensure that everything that we're doing at the agency is highlighting where we can build our relationships and partnerships with tribes.
Thank you, Secretary. And Geneva, I know that the governor made some incredible announcements earlier today on the eve of Native American Day. Are there any that you'd like to share with us?
Well, thank you. And we'll see you, everyone. Yes, we are very excited. You know, I think just kind of throughout the budget and what everyone's talking about is really ensuring that we are strengthening partnerships with tribal nations and in all of our work across the agency. Governor Newsom just issued a new proclamation today on California Native American Day, which we're very excited about, that really reiterates the state's commitment to partnering with tribal nations and looking for opportunities to increase co-management, access, and where feasible, return of ancestral lands. And so we're very excited about the proclamation today, the statement of administrative policy that Governor Newsom announced not too long ago, and how that really dovetails with the work that we're doing here at the agency. And so, very excited for the news today. And just to echo what Secretary Crowfoot said, happy California Native American Day.
Thank you, Geneva. There's another question around opportunities for funding sea level rise and flood resilience infrastructure in coastal urban areas. I'd like to perhaps invite our colleagues, Brian and Amanda, as well as others to help us answer that.
We're looking for information on the coastal areas. Was that the question?
Yes, funding for sea level rise, flood resilience infrastructure in coastal urban areas. Yeah, there's $400 million for coastal protection and adaptation, and $350 million for that in the 22-23 budget year, and then $50 million for the Ocean Protection Council, which is also related to coastal issues.
And if I might, oh, go ahead. I would just add that there's $30 million to the Coastal Commission to support local communities in planning, adaptation planning, and building resilience in local and regional plans across the coast, and an additional $11.5 million to state parks to really help them implement their sea level rise adaptation strategy that was just completed.
Yeah, and I would just add, in this webinar or this Zoom meeting today, we're going deep on resources within the Natural Resources Agency, but I want to make sure that people don't come away with the idea that we're somehow siloed and we're only, focused on funding within our agency. There's a lot of connective tissue or overlap in funding across agencies. In this case, building resilience to sea level rise, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or what we know as OPR, has some really important funding that is going to build the capacity of various regions across the state to build their own climate resilience. And so, as Jen was absolutely right, there'll be some funding through the Coastal Commission for planning in coastal communities impacted by sea level rise, but also communities across the state are going to be able to access that funding through OPR for their planning. So really excited about that. And then just an advertisement or a coming soon announcement, really we face all of these threats: wildfire, drought, flooding, extreme heat, sea level rise, but we can't address them separately. We recognize that climate resilience actually exists across those threats. And so our agency has a responsibility from legislation that passed about a decade ago to update the state's adaptation plan every 3 years. And this time around, we're doing that in partnership with OPR. And rather than a report, we're really building a framework that's going to live on the internet, that's really going to connect all of these sectoral efforts, drought, wildfire, et cetera, around some common core high-level principles, which we hope is really going to build the connection between the work that's happening on coastal climate resilience, but also more broadly community resilience. So the request is, when that draft adaptation plan comes out later this year, we want your feedback. Help us inform what our strategy is going to be moving forward, because that strategy is going to help define how we invest various pots of money. So thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, Secretary. There's another question on how this budget supports efforts around restoration at the Salton Sea. So I'd like to invite perhaps a couple of colleagues that are working on that to help us get there. Perhaps I'll start over with Brian and Amanda, and if others have something to add, please jump in.
Sure. The budget package includes, over the next 3 years, an additional $220 million to move forward on our 10-year phase 1 Salton Sea management program, which includes not only habitat, but also dust suppression projects at the Salton Sea. 40 million in this year, and then the remainder of the funds are spread over the next 2 years to keep moving forward on those efforts.
And I would just add, while we have people's attention about the Salton Sea, as Amanda pointed out, part of the focus is to implement this 10-year Salton Sea management plan. And that is getting 15,000 acres of habitat restoration and critically 15,000 acres of dust suppression. In other words, reduce or limit dust suppression that's coming up as the sea shrinks. So that's important, and that's the near-term work. And we're really glad that we actually have work underway, projects underway. We're also developing the future, the broader long-term future plan of the Salton Sea, and assessing whether it's feasible to import water. And if it's not, how are we going to actually manage the sea with the inflows that we have? There's an opportunity to actually participate in this long-term planning process. So if you Google our agency in Salton Sea, you can find out how to actually provide input to this long-term planning process. And I should just acknowledge Moises, who is our colleague working with us and really upping our game, ensuring that the outreach that we do with communities around the sea really integrates and provides an opportunity for them to share their vision, given that they're directly impacted from the future of the sea. So big thanks, Moy.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Alyssa in the chat asked around multi-benefit repurposing of agricultural land for implementation of SIGMA and if there's funding available. Nancy, can you help us with that?
Yeah, sure. Alyssa, there's $50 million in the budget for this coming budget year that would go to the Department of Conservation. This would be for creation of a new program. So the Department of Conservation will be working very closely with colleagues at the Department of Water Resources, the Department of Food and Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife, and others to create a grant program so that we can support the communities that have got critically overdrawn groundwater basins that are working towards bringing those basins into sustainable conditions of pumping and recharge. In some places, it's going to require that the footprint of agriculture shrink and that there's less irrigated agriculture in order to bring the groundwater basins into sustainable conditions for the long term. So that's our savings account to get through drought. So the $50 million will help start a conversation at the local level. There will be grants for regionally directed discussions about how we can put land to use in a way that helps protect ecosystems, protects public health, and also protects local economies.
Thank you, Nancy. There's another question around opportunities for engaging the conservancies in on-the-ground projects and funding opportunities for those conservancies, and whether these priorities are going to also be supported through funding opportunities there. Perhaps I'll pass it over to Brian and Amanda for that, and other colleagues, please join in.
Brian and Amanda, maybe I just frame this at a super high level. So, we are lucky to have 10 conservancies in our agency, and some of you may live in a part of the state with a conservancy, and they range from very large, long-standing conservancies like the Coastal Conservancy, for example, to smaller conservancies like the San Joaquin River Conservancy. From my view as secretary, these are critical entities to actually help us execute on our priorities. Climate resilience, equitable access, biodiversity protection, because these conservancies are based regionally. They know how to get the projects done. They also have unique tools that some of our other departments don't have, that actually allow them to bring in other sources of funding, whether it's federal funding or philanthropic funding. So I really consider the conservancies creative partners in executing our vision. And I'm thankful to them for sharing our priorities and really driving forward. And in fact, some of the initial funding that we established in our early action wildfire budget got out the door fastest through our conservancy partners. So excited about that and to continue to support the conservancies moving forward. And then Brian, I'll turn it over to you as it relates to the numbers and the funding.
Yeah, so for the 21-22 year, $60 million was set aside for conservancies, and there will be additional dollars in the various categories that you see where it's labeled various in the 22-23 year. That'll be determined through the fall budget process. In addition, there were dollars that were given to the conservancies in the wildfire package. And as Wade said, they were key partners in getting that money out the door quickly, and some of the first to actually get the money out the door. And we're really grateful to have the conservancies as our partners, and really recognize their work in helping us out.
And if I could just add, in addition to funding in the wildfire package, which is spelled out, someone said they had a hard time spelling out the conservancy funding. So very quickly, it spelled out in the Budget Act itself, $5.25 million for Tahoe and the Delta Conservancy each, 1.3 for San Joaquin and Baldwin Hills each, 2.5 million for Coachella Valley, and then 11.1 million for Santa Monica, Rivers and Mountains, San Diego, and Sierra Nevada. Each of those that year, that all adds up to 60 million. State Coastal Conservancy got quite a bit in a separate bucket, but also our conservancies got over 140 million in legislative priority projects. These are project specific to the conservancies in their jurisdiction, and we are really excited that we will be able to move all of this money through conservancies.
Thank you, Amanda. And speaking of partnerships across the state, there is a question and a note that much of the land in California is actually federally owned and managed. And there's an inquiry around how our funding or how this management and ownership is working in tandem with discussions that our team is having, and also how this affects our programs and budgets. Perhaps I'll turn it over to you, Secretary Crowfoot.
Yeah, I'm glad to report that the partnerships with federal agencies are certainly stronger in the last year than they have been in the previous 4. And we recognize that, boy, we're about 101 million acres in California. And depending how you count that, about 53% of our land mass is owned and managed by the federal agencies. And then, of course, beyond 3 miles off the coast, you're in federal waters. So the partnerships with the federal agencies are critical. And the good news is we're partnering with them fairly directly in a couple of different ways. Certainly in an area like wildfire, we actually use what's called good neighbor authority. So we can actually do work and spend funding on federal lands and in federal forests. And actually, and during certain years, as I understand it, over half of our forest health, our vegetation management is actually spent at reducing catastrophic fire risk in federal forests. And in the case of wildfire, we actually have a shared stewardship agreement that the governor signed with the chief of the U.S. Forest Service. But then thanks to Jen's leadership, we're also working with actually all federal land management agencies, be they large or small, on the 30 by 30 effort, which is not only a state target, but a federal target as well, that they talk about as America the Beautiful. And through a long established entity called the California Biodiversity Council, which is an intergovernmental coordination between the state and the federal, we're actually working to synergize efforts between the state and federal agencies to actually achieve 30 by 30 and land conservation in California. So those are a couple of examples of where we're partnering with the feds.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. There's another question around our outdoor access for all efforts and outdoor education programs, particularly around various schools promoting outdoor science programming. Undersecretary Barranco, is this included in the funding opportunities that we have available? And are there particular descriptions perhaps of some of the funding for outdoor programming that you can share with us?
Absolutely, very happy to. And good news is actually eligible applicants include all public agencies. So that's local, state, federal government, school districts, educational agencies, all sorts of different entities at the local level, including open space authorities, joint powers authorities, so et cetera, et cetera. The other group of eligible applicants includes nonprofit organizations with a 501c3 status. So there's lots of opportunity for folks who are engaging with the community at the governmental, but also in the nonprofit space to apply. It also is directed specifically to address access challenges in low-income urban and rural communities, and specifically at outdoor experiences at state parks and other public lands. And so that is pretty comprehensive. It doesn't have to be just at a state park. It can be in all different venues, federal parks, local parks, or just other types of open space. And that information can all be found on the state park site that has a ton of information in case you're interested in applying. I will note that the application deadline is October 8th, so it is coming up, so it's perfect timing. Please jump on. I'll put the link again once into the chat. And there's $57 million available currently. So a lot of great programming will be covered in this round of funding, and we just need to get the word out. So please share broadly and let us know if you have any other questions.
Thank you, Undersecretary. And we'll be putting into the chat the link to the budget information and the press release just released yesterday from the governor's announcement. And we do have a few more questions, and we see there are 428 of you still participating and listening in. So we appreciate you guys, and we're going to try to get to some of your questions as we promised. There's another inquiry here around urban forestry projects and if they're eligible under urban greening funding. There's a second question around, will urban greening projects be required to report in the cooling benefits they can generate? I'll turn that over to my colleague, Brian.
Yeah, urban forestry projects are eligible under urban greening program. The projects also, if they want to report how they, as part of the application process, they can provide how they actually provide cooling benefits that they generate or they anticipate to generate once the trees are planted.
Thank you, Brian. There's another question in here specifically around climate resilience efforts. Is there a source in the budget for seeking needed dollars for elements of climate resilience efforts where nature-based solutions aren't viable? Perhaps I'll turn that over to, well, perhaps Jen or other colleagues who'd like to jump in.
I actually don't have a good answer for that question. I'm sorry. I know about the nature-based solutions part of the budget. Wade, do you know?
Yeah, I think that there are, and I think, for example, on coastal resilience, I think that there is the potential for some of that coastal resilience funding to be spent on infrastructure protection that may not be nature-based solutions. I also know, for example, our colleagues in the California Transportation Agency have investments to build the resilience of that infrastructure as well. And then certainly on the water side, while we emphasize and prioritize nature-based solutions, we have plenty of infrastructure funding that supports sort of your more traditional infrastructure development. So on those kinds of questions, I think we can certainly follow up, and as we flesh these pots of money out in coming weeks, we'll be able to provide more specific answers.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. There's another question around our investment opportunities for certain fisheries, particularly around salmon and salmon fisheries and waters. Perhaps I can turn that over to Nancy to talk about some of the investments through the water resilience.
Yes, the habitat restoration funds that Jen and I both mentioned, most of those would have benefits for native fish, including salmon. I'm trying to think of other, I think a lot of the coastal streams investments and perhaps even the urban stream investments could have benefits for anadromous fish like steelhead and salmon. Our drought management is very much focused on making sure that streams stay connected and cool enough for our salmon, for that iconic California species, which is difficult to do in a drought. But I don't have a total figure that's targeted at salmon streams. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I would just add that, we talk about climate change being sort of code red, or we're at a code red moment in climate change. For some salmon species, we're at a code red, for their viability or their existence. And so we need to do everything that we can. And that includes what Nancy talked about, which is emergency drought actions, where Fish and Wildlife in some cases is literally trucking fish to ensure that they have enough water and the water at the right temperature to survive. So like the very near term actions. And then over the next couple of years, identifying additional flows into streams and rivers, both through some of this funding, but also through, kind of the regulatory update at the state water board. And then building much more habitat or restoring habitat and much more quickly than we've ever done. Simply put, we have to move faster restoring habitat than we have been able to do to date. And so that's some of the work we're doing. We call cutting the green tape, which is how do we help truly, environmentally beneficial restoration happen more quickly and cost effectively. So it's both, so I'd summarize it by saying emergency actions, more water into streams and rivers, and more habitat more quickly is our approach to actually, saving salmon.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. There's another question around CAL FIRE investments and how and when CAL FIRE will be getting out the remaining $280 million in forest health and fire prevention grants. Perhaps I can pass that to Jessica.
Yes. So CAL FIRE actually did incredibly fast work in getting the early action grants out the door. They started their grant applications prior to even the appropriation of the dollars. So they got work out on the ground and got those grants awarded probably about 6 months ahead of what would have been a normal schedule with a normal appropriation. The balance of the dollars that just got awarded yesterday, CAL FIRE is going to do a combination of directed grants, so people that already applied that we didn't have resources to fund, and potentially then some additional grant awards. So stay tuned; those will be moving quickly, and especially if you already have applications in, those will be reviewed for the existing pipeline.
Thank you, Jessica. There are a few last remaining questions. One around water catchment infrastructure grants and how they might fit into conservation measures in rural areas. Perhaps I'll turn that over to Nancy.
Can you read the question? Because I'm sorry, Andrea, I have not seen it.
No problem. Where might water catchment infrastructure grants fit into conservation measures in rural areas?
Water catchment. I know there are investments for the State Water Resources Control Board related to stormwater, which is largely urban, but not always entirely. With the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, we do have a great need to capture water when it's available into the winter flood flows and peak flows when we get big storms, so that we have that water to sink into the ground and recharge our aquifers for the dry times. And the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Resources Control Board are working hard on making sure that local agencies can capture those winter flood flows and use them to recharge groundwater. There's a lot of regulatory, there's permitting, and then, you know, there's funding for projects that are needed, because it does take some infrastructure. And there's $300 million in this budget that will help support local implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And that could include recharge projects that I'm assuming can include catchment in rural areas of getting the water when it's available for the dry times.
Thank you, Nancy. And this is a final question, which I think it raises a really great point. Leslie mentions that many times great projects and programs stop being managed after grant funding is exhausted. How is ongoing management being considered to ensure the success of this investment? And I do know that there are some funds available in the budget to address that. So perhaps I'll turn it over to Undersecretary Barranco, Brian, Amanda, for any thoughts you might have.
Well, I will also turn it over to our grants and funding professionals, but I do want to give a huge plug to our grants and bonds management teams, who really do work with these funds, not just from the day they are handed over to our local community partners or to our state and local partners, but you know, for the life of the projects, including, you know, decades later, where they're really working with all of you to ensure that that mitigation remains, or you know, these projects that build parks and improve communities remain in the, you know, in the investment of those communities. And so I will hand it over to Brian and Amanda to specifically answer the technical side, but just know we've got a really terrific team that does focus on this in the long term.
Yeah, we do have a unit to, go ahead, Amanda.
I was going to say, on our website, we have a unit within the Resources Agency called the Monitoring and Stewardship Unit, who is focused very much on the outcomes, the long term after a project is implemented. One of the challenges has been bond funds are there to build the project, but not used after, they can't be used for the ongoing maintenance. And so we have been in a 2-year process to gather, you know, how can we compare across like projects? So I would just refer to our website, again, the Monitoring and Stewardship Unit, and we do want to make sure that, you know, funds, the projects are funded, that they do last for the 20 or 30 years that we expect them to do. And we want to make sure we're doing it in a manner that is reasonable, you know, that is achievable, that is something that can be reported back and
We can use it for, continuous adaptation. If we did a project and it really didn't get us the results that we want, how can we turn around, adaptively manage, and make a better choice for a design of a project or a particular project in the long term? It's a very challenging question because so many of our projects are so broad. A wetlands project in one part of the state might be completely different than a wetlands project in another part of the state. Yes, they're both wetlands. So how can we measure something consistently across both of those that will help inform, as we have all said, science-based, evidence-based decision-making? So if you are interested in ideas about what that, what did that long-term monitoring look like? Absolutely engage with our monitoring and stewardship unit. They love to talk to all different people with all different ideas. And since this package is predominantly general fund, it doesn't have some of the same limitations that our bond funds have had in the past. So it's different opportunities here to try and make sure that we are indeed getting the bang for our buck of all of these wonderful investments, and more to come on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And perhaps another related question, given all of our priorities and the mention a bit earlier, Nancy, around the water resiliency portfolio, I would love to get your thoughts, given a question we received around how the water resiliency portfolio can support some of our climate resiliency work and how we're planning to engage our various departments, including our Department of Water Resources.
Yeah, the question was related to salmon and, the large dams on our salmon streams that are not going to go away. And it is a difficult situation as the climate warms. It gets more difficult to maintain the cold water pool that salmon need below those large dams. But I do want everyone to understand the state has teamed up with the Yurok and the Karuk and other tribes along the Klamath River and the state of Oregon to bring back the second largest river in California, the Klamath River. We've got an effort underway to remove 4 defunct hydropower dams on that river, that once we can get free flowing, once we can get more natural flows on the Klamath River, I think that will help eliminate a lot of the disease and parasite problems we're seeing for salmon. And certainly it will help with temperature. And we're hoping that the revival of the Klamath River can help all the tribal families and communities that have depended upon the native fish of that river for time immemorial, and then also the West Coast commercial and recreational fishery. So that effort is underway. That's a chance for fish passage on a big scale. There are also efforts underway. The Department of Fish and Wildlife is working with the National Marine Fisheries Service and our Caltrans, Department of Transportation, and lots of local partners to remove barriers across many different coastal streams. It's a lot easier, I think, just to improve fish passage on those coastal streams than it is on a place like the Sacramento River, where we depend upon Shasta Dam for so many things, from flood control to water supply.
Thank you, Nancy. And we see so many hundreds of you are still with us, but we're approaching some of our time, and we know we want to be respectful of your afternoon on a Friday. So before we end, I would like to invite some colleagues, if you have any final remarks before we end, or any additional information you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, I would just maybe conclude by pointing to in the chat, my colleague Amanda Martin shared a link to the budget addendum. And that's basically a fancy way to say the explanation of what we've just been talking about, both the narrative and also the charts that identify the specific pots of funding. So if you take a look at them and have further questions, Andrea, if you can put in the chat, what would be the best email for somebody to actually follow up with a specific question? And then whoever receives that email can then distribute the question. Really focused on truly on questions around the different sources of funding or how we're spending it. Let me say, in closing, thank you for all of the work that you're doing across the state on these shared goals. And we recognize that the reason why we have these resources, billions of dollars, is because you've made your voice heard on the importance of this funding, either with legislators or directly to our agency or into the governor's office. You know, we are only able to do our work thanks to you, both because of all the partnerships on the ground, but because you lift up these priorities. So we take that really seriously and want to be held accountable for spending this funding as quickly as we can, given the climate crises and other challenges we face, and then also ensuring that the money is effectively spent. It's our goal to get this money working across the state as quickly as practicable, so we can continue to make the case that investing in these priorities is needed and important, and that we need ongoing investments. So if you have any suggestions around how we can be working more quickly, recognizing that we have our processes and there's some legal requirements in terms of what we need to do, let us know. We're excited to continue to work all together. Thanks so much. Please have a safe and healthy weekend, and we look forward to working with you in coming weeks and months. Take care.